if people haven't read the Bible, they should, if they consider themselves educated.
Calling yourself educated and not having read the Bible is like calling yourself a movie nerd and not having watched Steven Spielberg.
And you could read Proverbs and find tremendous wisdom in there. There's something in you that comes alive and knows that there's a truth there.
And I read a lot of books. I read all the self-help books I could get. I was reading Ayn Rand and trying to get a hang on to something to make me a better human being. I really was. It wasn't working. I went through my whole life trying to feel like I belonged on this planet somewhere. And it just wasn't working. And we're sitting on the fairway one day just talking. And we're talking about life, we're talking about this, we're talking about that. And then he brings up the Bible. And I said, don't give me the Bible, I don't want to hear the Bible. And he says, what do you mean? And I said, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in that garbage. And he says, well, what is it about the Bible you don't think is true? And I said, I don't know, I never read it. And he said, well, you're not an atheist, you're a moron. And I asked him to explain himself, and he said, well, to be honest with you, a true atheist is not only a biblical scholar, but is scholarly in all the face of the earth. And after a long intellectual journey has come to the conclusion that there is no God of the universe. You, on the other hand, want to circumvent the entire intellectual process and just come to the conclusion that there's no God. That's lazy and moronic. I didn't know what to say.
Dismissing the Bible without reading it is like criticizing a movie without watching it.
Probably a lot of you know that I've spent a lot of my life reading texts from philosophers and religious writers and spiritual writers, and Plato, Aristotle, Confucius, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, Anselm, Aquinas, Kant, Hegel, all these people in the course of my studies. Ideas, arguments, fine inspirational notions. Musing detachment as they're talking about these high ideas. They're in a philosophical, sort of calm frame of mind. Well, there's all that, and then there's the gospel. I want us to see the contrast between detached philosophical musing, but there's a contrast between all of that and the Gospels. Gospel, Godspell, good news, good news. Now, Confucius, Aristotle, Plato, Aquinas, Anselm, okay, they're interesting and they're wonderful and they're full of deep ideas, but it's not exactly newsy. It's not text that you want to say, hey, let me tell you about this. Something happened. But then there's the Gospels. Yes, they've inspired philosophers, and yes, they've inspired spiritual teachers. All that's true. But at their heart, they're not abstracted philosophical musing. They're the urgent conveying of news. Something happened. Something happened, and I need you to know about it. He's saying, hey, did you hear what happened? Let me tell you about this Jesus, this person, because God raised him from the dead. We're not talking about myths here. We're not talking about vague abstractions. Oh, it's a story about the dying and rising of the crops. Come on. That's not what he's doing here. He's talking about this Jesus whom he knew, and maybe some of you heard about him and knew him, and something happened to him.
The short version is I was an atheist and a skeptic, and a very proud one. And when I was challenged to read the best-selling book of all time, the one that is so best-selling they leave it off the bestseller list because it dwarfs everything else each week, as I read that book, I started to realize there was a lot of wisdom and intelligence in that book, and that it wasn't just a bunch of goofy made-up stuff that I thought it might be when I went to read it. And through a process of reading, asking questions, and many years of gathering data about it, actually, I gradually felt myself changing. I became somebody who started to believe not only that a possible God existed, but maybe it was more probable than not. And I started to see if that made a difference in my life. and then gradually started to embrace the Christian worldview. And that has actually made a huge difference in my life. So now I've run the experiment both ways, and I definitely prefer the Christian worldview.
I just believed the Bible was wrong without having read it. And it occurred to me that that was actually kind of an inconsistent intellectual position, right? To think that I was so well educated and knew about the Bible, but I actually hadn't read it. So I figured I could fix that. So I got a Bible and decided I would read through the Bible in a year, one of those Bibles with the little check marks in it, so you could check off the 4 books a day you read or whatever. And so I started reading the Bible, and I realized as I was reading it, actually I started in Proverbs, that there was incredible wisdom in there. And I, who thought, religious people were so stupid, had to acknowledge that there was a lot for me to learn from what I was reading there. So I read on, and I actually wound up rereading the Bible every year for about 10 years, actually. And during the course of that reading, because each time I read, I got something that I'd missed the time before, I think there was a gradual change taking place in me. Certainly, I realized right away that my intellectual doubts were largely based on, ironically, on myths of society. Sometimes people accuse religious people of believing in myths. I think maybe the greater myth is in our society that, religion is not based on anything solid. And what I was finding was what was in the Bible was actually based on a lot of solid historical events and a lot of incredibly brilliant and wise instruction and knowledge and experience that I certainly couldn't dismiss as non-intellectual or as non-relevant to my life. My views at the time were that Christians, and actually all religions I was pretty antagonistic toward, were people who really didn't know their science or maybe they needed a crutch or something. I really didn't think they were that smart. Then I started to realize that many of such people were super smart, and they challenged me to read the best-selling book of all time. I started to realize that the religion was not at all what I thought it was, and that there were some really interesting and very attractive elements that were very historically verified also, not at all what I expected. And as I learned about that, I changed my viewpoint gradually from an atheist to an agnostic to a theist to somebody who actually believed that the historical Jesus and the New Testaments, what's written about him, was true. It sounds a little wacky to those who may not come from that background. It was not an easy process. It made a huge difference in my life, for the better, big improvement. So I didn't realize it needed so much improving at the time. Those around me saw the difference. And today it is my source of strength, an amazing source of peace and joy and wisdom. What matters most is what you believe. Have you read the Bible? And I thought, I've heard that's the best-selling book of all time. No, I haven't read it. Maybe I should, because I considered myself a smart person. I should read the Bible. So I got one of those read the Bible through a year, checkbox. I think it was called The Way. It was one of those paraphrase versions. And I started reading the Bible. And to my not wanting to tell anybody what was happening in me, I started to change. It started to change me. And I thought it would be sort of full of fantastical, crazy stuff. They actually had me start with Proverbs, which was smart because it was full of so much wisdom that I'd read a few verses and I'd have to put it down and ponder what was going on here. And it immediately hit me with my sort of intellectual arrogance that I had a lot to learn from what was written here. And they asked if I'd ever read the Bible. And I realized that, hey, this is the #1 best-selling book of all time, and no, I hadn't read it. And if I wanted to be the smart person I thought I was, then I should read the Bible. How can you be educated if you haven't read the Bible? So they suggested I start by reading Proverbs, which is, you can read one chapter a day for a month. It's very light reading. And I thought, sure, I'll read that, and I imagined it would be full of this fanciful stuff that I could easily, in my snobby, arrogant, self-centered way, looked down upon. And as I started reading it, I realized, oh my, there's real wisdom in here. There is stuff for the most intellectual person to be challenged by, to really think about. And as I started to realize that, I realized I really need to read the whole Bible, which I then proceeded to do in a year, checking off boxes, how many books a day from the Old Testament, the New Testament. And as I did that quietly, without wanting to share it with anybody, I found myself being challenged and changed. I found myself starting to believe in God, which I did not want to believe in. So that worried me a little bit. So then I decided I need to study world religions and see if I study some other one, is it going to make me believe, or lead me to that predisposition? Maybe I'm just shaped by my culture, the Judeo-Christian culture in America. So I visited mosques and temples and met people from lots of different religious faiths. I studied it in school in an independent studies program that my high school let a certain number of students do some independent activities. And through quite a long process, I decided that the evidence for Christianity was very powerful and was greater than what I was finding in a lot of these other traditions, although I think all of these religious traditions are filled with great people and have lots of wonderful things to offer. I think, there are truths in a lot of these, but the truths of Christianity don't agree. But you can't just say they're all the same. They say things that are different from each other. So I felt challenged to believe in God. And then later, as I went to college, this took me many years. I was not a happy convert. I was sort of fighting it the whole time. But as I went to college and got more questions answered and learned more, not just about God, but about Jesus Christ, then I took another step, which was not just to allow that God might exist, but to allow that not only did Jesus exist historically and what he taught, is so incredible and inspiring and challenging, but I could also embrace Jesus in a different role, a role with a relationship, a role as who is in charge of my life. Is it me, or am I going to hand that off to someone who I think knows better than I do? And when I ran that experiment, I became a Christian. And that was a very big step, not an easy step, but the greatest step I've ever taken. Really made all the difference in my life.
So, if you've never read the Bible but call yourself educated, what are you waiting for? What are you afraid of?